My name is Eleanor, and for the first 74 years of my life, I believed I understood my family. I believed I understood what held us together, the invisible threads, the shared language, the kind of love that doesn't always look like love from the outside, but is love deep down, in all the ways that count. I believed I understood the arguments and the silences and the complicated distances that form in families over decades. The way furniture drifts slowly across a room without anyone deciding to move it. I believed that when my children argued, it was because they cared. That's what I'd always told myself. They fight because they feel things deeply. That's what love looks like in a family that doesn't always find the right words for it. And then, one Tuesday morning in February, I collapsed on my kitchen floor. And when I woke up in that hospital bed, the IV in my arm, the antiseptic smell of the room, the beeping of the monitor, I could hear my children's voices in the hallway outside my door, arguing, in a way I had never quite heard before. I couldn't make out the words, not yet, but I could hear the intensity, the urgency, and I smiled. I want you to hold on to that image, an old woman, alone in a hospital room, frightened and exhausted, listening to her children argue in the hallway, and smiling, because she thought, they're scared, because they love me. Look at this. They're fighting over me. I thought it was love. 2 weeks later, I overheard a conversation in my own kitchen, a conversation I was never meant to hear, and everything I had told myself about my family quietly fell apart. I need to take you back a little so you understand who I am. Not because I want your sympathy. I've lived long enough to know that everyone, every single person watching this, is carrying something, but because you can't understand what happened without knowing where I came from, what I believed, what I built. I grew up in a small Ohio town. My parents were practical, church-going people who expressed love the way their generation did, through action, not language. My mother cooked. My father worked. Everything that needed to be said was said through what was done, and a great deal was left unsaid. I absorbed that, more than I realized, for most of my life. I married Frank when I was 23 years old. We were young and ambitious, in the modest way of people who don't have much, but believe they can build something. We were right about that, at least. 47 years. 2 difficult decades, 1 beautiful one, and the rest somewhere in between, the honest, complicated middle of a real marriage. Frank used to say that a marriage is like a kitchen table. The older it gets, the more scratches it has, and the more beautiful it is, because you can see everything it survived. I still have that table. We had 4 children. Susan was first born when Frank and I were still learning how to be adults, let alone parents. Then Robert, 17 months after. Then Diane, 4 years later, when we'd finally caught our breath. And then Thomas, our youngest, our surprise, who arrived when the others were already in school and turned out to be, in some ways, the most quietly essential of all of them. They grew up in the house I'm still living in. The house Frank and I bought when we were 30 years old, terrified it was too big a decision for our bank account, too in love with it to walk away. 4 bedrooms. A backyard with an oak tree that Frank planted from a sapling the year Robert was born. A front porch with 2 rocking chairs we sat in together for 20 years, watching the street change slowly around us. I know you might have a place like that in your mind right now, a place that holds your whole life inside it. If you do, you understand what I mean when I say that house is not just a building. It is Frank's voice when he came through the back door. It is my children on Christmas mornings. It is every argument and reconciliation and Sunday dinner and ordinary Tuesday afternoon that passed through it over 44 years. It is me. When Frank died 4 years ago, my children all made the same argument in 4 different ways. Mum, you shouldn't be alone in that house. And I said the same thing to all of them. I am 70 years old, not 90. I know where I am and where I'm going. They worried, and I reassured them, and life settled into a new pattern, quieter, lonelier, but mine. My doctor watched my blood pressure. My neighbour Patricia kept a spare key. I had my routines, my water aerobics class on Wednesdays, my phone calls with the children every week, and the radio on every morning, because silence in the mornings felt too much like grief. I managed. I was managing. But the winter before the Tuesday in February had been harder than the others. I won't overdramatize it. A fainting spell in November I didn't tell the children about. Persistent headaches behind my right eye that I told myself were tension or barometric pressure, or any of the reasonable explanations an older woman tells herself when she doesn't want to give her children something to worry about. And a tiredness, not the normal tiredness of a body getting older, but something deeper, something that lived beneath the surface and made certain mornings feel like climbing. I should have said something. I know that now. Let me tell you about the Tuesday morning. I was making oatmeal. The radio was on the morning program I always listened to. The host with the warm voice and the unhurried delivery. The February light was coming through the kitchen window, pale and clean. That particular winter angle that doesn't warm anything but illuminates everything. I was thinking about nothing in particular. The oatmeal was about 30 seconds from done, and then the floor came up to meet me. I don't remember falling. I remember being on the floor. I remember the linoleum was cold against my cheek. I remember looking at the legs of Frank's kitchen table from a very unfamiliar angle, and I remember thinking, with a strange clarity, well, this is not ideal. My neighbour Patricia had a spare key, and the beautiful life-saving habit of stopping by on Tuesday mornings to say hello and steal one of my blueberry muffins if I'd been baking. She found me about 40 minutes after I went down. She called 911. She called Susan. And somewhere in the chain of calls that followed, all 4 of my children were alerted that something had happened to their mother. By the time I was coherent enough to understand where I was and what the machines around me were for, a cardiologist was explaining a term to me, transient ischemic attack, a TIA, what some people call a mini-stroke, though my doctor didn't like that term. Not a full stroke, he said. No permanent damage as far as they could tell, but a significant warning from my brain and cardiovascular system that things could no longer continue as they had been. I was terrified. I say that plainly because I don't often say it. I am not a person who admits fear easily. Frank used to call it my best quality and my most aggravating quality simultaneously. But lying there, looking at that hospital ceiling, thinking about my house and the oak tree and the kitchen table, thinking about the fact that Patricia might not have come by that Tuesday, that I might have lain there on that cold floor for hours or days, yes, I was terrified. And then I heard voices in the hallway. Susan arrived first. She lives 40 minutes away, and she moves through the world with a kind of propulsive energy, especially in a crisis, the energy of a woman who has spent 63 years being the first one to arrive and the last one to leave. She came through the door, took my hand in both of hers, and cried in a way she would have been embarrassed by if she'd been watching herself. Susan has her father's eyes, dark and very direct. When she looked at me, I felt seen in that particular way only your oldest child can make you feel like someone who has known you since before either of you really knew anything. Robert arrived about an hour later. My son, Robert, is 59 years old, and he has been a practical man for as long as I can remember, measured, strategic, always thinking several steps ahead of the present moment. He came in, hugged me for exactly the right amount of time, assessed the room with those level eyes of his, asked clear questions of the nurse that I suspect the nurse appreciated, and wrote notes in the small, leather-bound notebook he carries everywhere. That's Robert. He processes through organization. He always has. Diane came with her husband Gerald, 56 years old, my second daughter beautiful and composed in the particular way of someone who is working hard to remain composed, whose inner weather is complicated, but whose outer presentation is meticulous. Diane has always cared most about how things appear, not out of vanity, or not only out of vanity, but because appearances have always been, for Diane, a kind of protection. If everything looks all right, Maybe everything is all right. She held my hand and told me I had given her the fright of her life, and I believed her completely. Thomas came last. He had to fly from Portland, and he walked into my hospital room around 8 o'clock that night, still wearing his coat, slightly breathless, looking younger and older at the same time, in the way the youngest child somehow always manages to. He sat down next to the bed without saying anything, put his hand over mine, stayed. Thomas, my quietest one, the one I understand least and love in the most uncomplicated way. Now I want to be honest about what I heard from that hospital bed, what I initially understood about the arguing in the hallway, because it is easy, looking back from where I am now, to hear it as something it wasn't, not entirely. Susan wanted me to come home with her after discharge. She had already talked to David, she said. They had the guest room. She could take time from work. It wouldn't be a problem. It was the most sensible geographic solution. Robert interrupted her to say that a single person taking time from work was not a sustainable structure, and that what the family needed was a longer-term plan, not an improvised short-term fix. He said the word structure in the way Robert always says important words clearly, as though the precision of language will make the idea itself more solid. Diane said she had done some research, and there were some very good facilities in the area that might be worth at least looking at, that might provide the kind of support none of them individually could. And Thomas said, almost too quietly to hear through the door, maybe we should ask Mum what she wants. I lay there, and I felt my heart, my already compromised heart, fill with something that felt, genuinely, like gratitude, like warmth. My children, I thought. Look at them. They're fighting because they're afraid of losing me. That's love. That's what that is. I thought that for 2 weeks. I believed it with everything I had. If you've ever been in a place in your life where you felt invisible, where the world had quietly reorganized itself around you in a way that left you out, you might understand exactly why that arguing in the hallway felt like something precious to me. I was, in that moment, the center of something. I was being seen. I was being claimed. I should have listened more carefully to what was being said. I came home to my own home, not Susan's, because I won that particular argument with more stubbornness than my cardiologist would have approved of 5 days after the collapse. I came home with a new battery of medications, a strict set of instructions, and the absolute certainty of 4 children who believed my judgment about my own well-being was temporarily unreliable. The rotation was established. Someone would stay with me for the first 2 weeks. Susan would take the first week. Robert and Carol would come for a long weekend. Diane would follow. Thomas extended his trip to overlap with the early days. I told them all it was unnecessary. They looked at me with the unified expression of adult children who have decided something and are not going to be talked out of it by the person they've decided it about. So my house quiet, mine, a space I had shaped over 4 years of solitary living into something that suited me exactly suddenly had people in it again. Susan is a good woman. I need you to understand that, before I say anything that might make it seem otherwise. She is a genuinely good woman who has loved this family, loved me in ways that demanded real sacrifice and received inadequate acknowledgement. She was the one who came home in her 30s when her father had his first health crisis and her own career was beginning to find its footing. She was the one who drove me to appointments and remembered follow-up dates and called every single week without fail, even during the years when the calls were hard and she was carrying her own private difficulties and had nothing left to give, and gave anyway. But there is a particular kind of exhaustion that accumulates in the person who is always the dependable one, and I saw it in Susan's eyes that first week, in a way I hadn't let myself see it before. She moved through my kitchen with a controlled, careful efficiency that I recognized because I had moved through my own home that way for many years when I was running a household and trying not to let the seams show. She organized my medications into a color-coded tray without asking whether I wanted that. She moved the hallway furniture slightly without explaining why. She made a typed list of emergency contacts. Doctor, pharmacy, neighbors, all 4 siblings, and taped it to the refrigerator door. I looked at that list on the refrigerator door. I thought, she made this at home. She thought about this before she arrived. She has been thinking about this, probably, for longer than I knew. One evening, the 4th night, a quiet Wednesday, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my tea while Susan stood at the sink washing the dinner dishes. She was looking out the window at the backyard. The oak tree was bare, its winter silhouette dark against the last pale light. I watched her back, the set of her shoulders. I said, "Susan, are you all right?" She kept washing the dish. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her eyes were dry, but her jaw was set in the particular way it gets when she has been working to keep them that way. She said, "I'm fine, Mum. I'm just worried about you." I believed her. I believe she meant it. But something in me filed away that image Susan at the sink, her back to me, her shoulders carrying something that had no name yet. Robert arrived that weekend. He came in with Carol, cheerful and purposeful, with a bag of food from a restaurant he knows I like, and a manner that suggested a pleasant family weekend. For the first hour, it was pleasant. And then he began walking through the house. He did it gradually, naturally, as though he was just stretching his legs, just familiarizing himself with a space he'd grown up in. He paused in the hallway and looked at the ceiling where there'd been a water stain from a leak we'd fixed 3 years ago. He opened the hall closet and looked at the water heater with the careful eyes of someone doing an inspection. He stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard for a long time, at the garden and the old fence and the oak tree, with an expression I could not immediately name. That evening, after dinner, he sat down across from me at Frank's table and said he wanted to talk about the practicalities. He said it gently. He said it with genuine care in his voice. And I want to be fair to him, because I believe that care was real. But he talked about the cost of long-term care. He talked about Medicare gaps. He talked about planning ahead, while decisions can still be made clearly, which was, I understood, a diplomatic way of referring to my current mental competence as something that might not be permanent. And then, toward the end, almost as an aside, in the tone he uses for things he wants to seem minor, he asked about the house. He said, "Have you and your estate attorney spoken recently, Mum, just to make sure everything is current?" I said my will was in order. He said, "And the house, is that addressed directly, or is it folded into the general estate?" I looked at my son across Frank's kitchen table. Outside the window, behind him, the oak tree stood in the February dusk, and I said, "The house is in the will, Robert. Everything is properly handled." He nodded, said good, and moved on to asking whether my gutters had been cleaned. I thought about that exchange for a long time afterward. I told myself, he's a practical man. He thinks about these things. That's his nature. It doesn't mean anything. I had a long, patient conversation with myself, in which I talked myself away from the discomfort I'd felt, replaced it with charitable explanations, and arrived at the familiar conclusion that I was probably reading too much into a simple question. I was very good at that. I had been doing it for years. If you've ever lain awake making excuses for someone you love, finding the benign explanation, the reasonable interpretation, the version of events that lets everyone stay exactly who you need them to be, then you know what those nights were like for me. I would lie in that bedroom looking at the photographs on the wall, and I would review the day in my mind the way a bookkeeper reviews ledgers, looking for the place where something didn't balance. Robert's question, Susan's posture at the sink, the particular quality of Diane's attention when she arrived a day later with her folder. I talked to Frank in those hours. I know how that sounds. I don't care. I talked to him the way you talk to someone who knew you better than anyone else ever did, and whom you miss so completely that silence starts to feel like loss all over again. I said, "Frank, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? Or am I an old woman looking for shadows in an ordinary room?" And in the quiet, in the way the mind works when it finally stops defending itself, I heard something, not his voice exactly, but the memory of something he used to say, "Ellie, you always see the best in people first. That's a gift. Just don't let it become a way of not seeing the rest." I pulled the blanket up. I looked at the ceiling. I thought, what am I not letting myself see? Diane arrived on the Wednesday of the second week. She brought meals organized in labeled containers, a new set of bath mats, and a shower chair still in its packaging. She presented each of these as practical gifts, which they were, and I thanked her for them. Then she brought the folder. She placed it on the table after dinner, when the dishes were done, and Gerald had gone to watch television in the other room, when it was just the two of us, with our decaf and the kitchen light warm above us. She placed it in front of me with a careful expression and said, "Mum, I just want you to have this. You don't have to look at it now, or ever, really. I just wanted you to know these options exist." I opened it. The first brochure showed a large, well-lit building set among manicured grounds, happy people in common rooms, warm colours chosen by someone who understood that warm colours communicate safety. The word community appeared, as I counted them, 14 times in the first 2 pages. There were photographs of women doing watercolour painting, of couples walking flower-lined paths, of a woman reading in a sunlit chair with a look of serene contentment that I suspect required several hours and a professional photographer to achieve. I closed the folder. Diane was watching me with the expression she'd been wearing, I now realized, since she'd arrived, carefully neutral, carefully warm, underneath which something else was moving that I hadn't been willing to name. I said, "Diane, I am not going to a facility." She said, "Mum, I'm not asking you to. I just wanted you to have the information. That's all. Just so it exists in your mind as a possibility, somewhere down the road." I looked at my daughter, Diane, who had always cared about the surface of things, not falsely, not maliciously, but genuinely, as though the presentation of a thing was part of its reality. I had not always understood her. We were too different in that particular way. She had Gerald's world, Gerald's friends, their careful suburban life with its charity events and its put-together holidays. And that was her life, honestly built, genuinely lived. But I looked at her across the table and I thought, when did you prepare that folder? How long have you had it? I didn't ask. I put the folder in the kitchen drawer, beneath some other papers, because I couldn't throw it away and couldn't look at it. And every time I opened that drawer in the days that followed for a pen, for a rubber band, for a takeout menu, I could see its corner, that glossy, cheerful corner, the edge of a building surrounded by manicured grounds. The night before Diane was scheduled to go home, 9 days after I'd left the hospital, I couldn't sleep. I have always been prone to nights like this. Even as a younger woman, the mind decides something needs working out, and sleep becomes impossible until the working out begins. I came downstairs around midnight. I made chamomile tea. I sat at Frank's table in the dark kitchen without turning on the overhead light. Just the small light above the stove, the one we always left on when the children were teenagers coming home late. I was sitting there, cup in both hands, looking at nothing in particular, listening to the February quiet when I heard footsteps. 2 sets of footsteps on the stairs. Hushed voices moving through the hallway into the living room. I recognized them immediately. Robert's voice, measured, careful, and Diane's. "I need to tell you something about this moment before I tell you what I heard. I have thought about this moment more times than I can count. I have held it up to the light from every angle, trying to understand it, trying to be fair to the people I heard speaking. I do not believe my children are bad people. I have never believed that. What I am about to tell you is not a story about villains. It is a story about frightened human people saying frightened human things in the dark when they believed no one was listening." Robert said, "She looked at the folder, Robert. She shut it immediately." That was Diane. Robert said, "Of course she did. You can't approach it that way." Diane said, "Well, how would you suggest approaching it?" A pause. The soft sound of someone lowering themselves onto the couch. Then Robert's voice, more composed, more deliberate. The house is the issue. As long as she's in that house, she's going to feel like she's in control. We need her to come to the realization herself that it's too much for one person, that it's not practical. Diane said, "She'll never agree to sell it, Robert. You know that." And Robert said, "And I want you to hear this in the way that I heard it," which was not with the voice of cruelty, but with the voice of a man making calculations about a situation he had already decided was inevitable. He said, "She doesn't have to agree. She just has to reach a point where she can no longer argue effectively." And honestly, Diane at 74, with a TIA and blood pressure that's been unstable for 2 years, that point may not be that far away. I sat in the dark. I did not move. I held my teacup in both hands, and I did not move. There is a kind of pain that doesn't announce itself with heat. It arrives cold. It settles slowly like water finding its level, filling every corner of a space before you quite understand that the space is full. That is what happened to me, sitting at that table in the dark. Not a sharp pain. A slow, cold, total one. My son had just said, in the house I have lived in for 44 years, that he was planning for the time when I would no longer be capable of resisting. Not because he hated me, not because he was a greedy, calculating person without a conscience. I could hear in his voice that he was tired, that he was worried, that he was doing in the only way he knew how to do things, what he believed needed doing. But he was planning around me. He was speaking about my future, about my capacity, my timeline, my home as a logistics problem to be managed. And I was not in the room. I was in the room. I was 10 feet away. But I was not in the room. They talked for a while longer. About the real estate market in this area, Robert had been tracking it. It emerged for at least a year. About the value of the house against the cost of a good facility. About what a fair arrangement would look like for all four of them, which was a phrase that lodged itself in my chest and stayed there. And then Diane said something that changed her slightly in my understanding, because she said quietly, "Robert, she is still here. She is still here. I don't think we should be talking about this." And Robert said, "We have to talk about it, Diane. Someone has to be realistic." There was a silence, and then Diane said very softly, "I know, I feel terrible." And Robert said, "I feel terrible too. That doesn't mean it doesn't need to be thought about." I sat at Frank's kitchen table for a long time after they went back upstairs. I sat in the dark with my cold tea and the faint glow of the stove light and the oak tree visible through the window as a dark shape against a darker sky, and I thought about what it means to be old and loved and used as a variable in someone else's equation, all at the same time. I thought about the word realistic. I thought about all the things that get hidden inside that word. If you've ever experienced the particular kind of grief that doesn't come from losing someone, but from understanding someone differently, from having a picture of a person shift in your mind permanently, while the person themselves is standing at your breakfast table pouring themselves coffee as if nothing has happened, then you know what the next morning was like. Robert came down first. He was completely normal. He asked how I'd slept. He commented on the weather. He talked about his drive home and something he'd heard on the radio. He was himself, entirely himself, the Robert I had known for 59 years. I answered pleasantly. I was warm. I gave nothing away. Because between midnight and 6 in the morning, while the house was quiet around me, I had done something I hadn't expected. I had stopped feeling and started thinking. This is what I mean when I say that living 74 years teaches you something, even when the lessons are hard. Feelings are immediate and loud and not always reliable. Thinking the slow, honest kind is what gets you through. The feelings would come. They always do, eventually. And they came for me in the weeks ahead, privately, in ways I'll tell you about. But first, in the grey February morning with my son at my counter, I needed to understand what I had actually heard. I thought about Robert, my firstborn son, 19 months after Susan. The child who arrived before Frank and I were entirely ready and made us ready anyway. Robert had always been the planner, the one who believed that if you thought far enough ahead, you could protect yourself from what was coming. He had built a good life on that belief. And now he was 59 years old, looking down the barrel of retirement, carrying whatever private financial anxieties he had never shared with me, and looking at this house and seeing what? Security? Unfinished business? A piece of the future he'd been counting on, quietly, without admitting it. I thought about Diane, my second daughter, who had always lived slightly at an angle to the rest of us, always translating, always mediating between what she felt and what she showed, always caring, deeply and genuinely, about how things looked from the outside. Diane wanted control of this story. An old woman slowly declining in a house that was becoming too much for her was not a controllable narrative. A mother gracefully transitioned to an appropriate, well-appointed facility that was something Diane could manage, something she could point to, if the neighbors or the cousins or her own children ever asked, as evidence of a family that did the right thing. She wasn't wrong that something needed addressing, but she was addressing herself, not me. And Susan, my eldest, standing at the sink with her back to me and her shoulders holding something she wouldn't name. I thought about what Susan had already given, the career detour in her 30s, the years of caregiving during Frank's illness, the calls and appointments and quiet accumulations of service that nobody had ever totaled up or thanked her for properly, including me. Susan loved me with the particular fierce, exhausted love of someone who has been dependable for so long that dependability has become indistinguishable from who they are, and who is terrified to find out who they'd be without it. What was she afraid of? That it would never end. That caring for me would consume what was left of the time she had for her own life. That she loved me too much to say no, and that would cost her everything. How do you say that to your mother? You don't. So you stand at the sink with your back turned and your jaw set, and you do it anyway, and you call it love because you don't have another word for it. And Thomas, who had said almost nothing, who had sat beside my bed and held my hand, who had, at the very first moment, asked the only question that mattered. Maybe we should ask Mum what she wants. Thomas found me in the backyard that afternoon. I had come out without quite meaning to, just needing air, needing space, needing to stand somewhere outside of walls for a while. I was standing near the oak tree, looking up at it the way you look at something that holds years inside it. He came through the back door and stood beside me without asking why I was there. After a long moment, he said, "How are you actually doing, Mum?" I looked at my youngest son. He has Frank's eyes. This has always startled me, the way that particular quality of patient attention came through so clearly in him. He was watching me with the careful, unhurried focus of someone much older than 51. I said, "I heard Robert and Diane talking last night, Thomas." He didn't look surprised. He looked sad, in the honest way of someone who had been waiting for this conversation, without knowing exactly what form it would take. I said, "How long has this been going on?" He looked at the tree for a moment, then back at me. He said, "I think Robert's been worried about the house for a while. A year, maybe 2. He doesn't say much directly, you know how he is. But I've heard things, in passing. He worries about the practical side of everything. He always has." I said, "And Diane?" Thomas said, "Diane worries about what she can't control. She always has. I don't think she's Mum. She doesn't mean it as cold as it might have sounded. She genuinely thinks she's doing what's right." I said. She didn't argue with him very effectively. Thomas was quiet. He didn't try to fix that. I said, "What about Susan?" He took a breath. "Susan is carrying a lot, more than most of us have ever fully seen, I think. And when you got sick, all of it came up at once. The worry, the responsibility, He paused. "She loves you so much, Mum. But loving you costs her. And she's been paying that cost for a long time, and she's tired. And she doesn't know how to say that without feeling like she's failed you somehow." I looked at this son of mine, this quiet, patient, sometimes difficult to reach son, who had moved to Portland years ago, and whom I sometimes felt I knew least and loved in the simplest way. I said, "Thomas, when did my children stop seeing me as a person and start seeing me as a situation to be managed?" He met my eyes. His own were full. He said, "Mum, I don't think it happened all at once." I said gently, "I'm not angry. I'm asking because I want to understand." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with the kind of honesty that takes courage, even when you're only talking to your mother, "I think it happened slowly after Dad died. I think losing him changed the way all of us see you. You became the last piece of the past, the connection to who we all were when we were young, and to Dad, and to this house, and to the version of ourselves that still had parents. And I think at the same time you became the thing that reminded us all of our own mortality, of getting older, of what's coming for all of us eventually." He stopped. "That's terrifying for people, even people who love you, maybe especially them." We stood together in that cold backyard for a long time, and something in me shifted, not broke, not shattered, but shifted, like a lens finally focusing. My children were not trying to hurt me. They were frightened. Each of them was standing in front of me and seeing, reflected in my age and my illness and my vulnerability, something of their own deepest fears. Robert saw financial instability and the weight of obligation. Diane saw the loss of control and the exposure of imperfection. Susan saw years of invisible labor stretching ahead of her without end. And each of them, in their own way, had done what frightened people do. They had converted the fear into action, into planning, into conversations at midnight that I wasn't meant to hear. Not because they didn't love me, but precisely because they did. And that love was all tangled up with what my aging meant for their own lives, their futures, their freedom, their peace. Love mixed with fear doesn't always come out looking like love. If you're watching this and you recognize something in what I've just described in your own family, on either side of this kind of relationship, I hope you'll sit with that recognition for a moment. Not with judgment, with honesty, because most of us have been on both sides. Most of us have loved someone and been afraid of what that love would cost us. Most of us have looked at an aging parent and felt things we weren't particularly proud of feeling. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. I called a family meeting the next morning. I said it simply at breakfast, the way I used to say it when they were young and I had something serious to address. "I'd like everyone together this afternoon before anyone travels. I have something I want to say." No drama, no announcement of what was coming, just the tone that meant, this is not optional. They gathered in the living room at 2:00. Susan on the couch, Robert in the armchair where he'd sat since his teenage years, Diane beside Gerald on the love seat, Thomas on the footstool near the window where the afternoon light was coming through. They arranged themselves the way a family does, in the positions they've always occupied, which say something true about who each person is. I stood. I made the deliberate choice to stand. I said, "I want to talk to you about something, and I want to be heard. Not just politely listened to while you think of your response, actually heard. I've spent 74 years being the person in this family who listened. I would like 10 minutes where the listening goes the other way." No one spoke. I said, "I know that my getting sick frightened you. All of you. And I know that fear makes people do things, say things, plan things that they might not do in calmer moments. I am not standing here to punish anyone for being afraid. I let that settle. I said, but I need to say something clearly, and I need you to carry it with you. I am not gone. I have not gone anywhere. I am not confused. I am not a situation that requires managing around my back. I am your mother, the same person who made this kitchen, raised you in this house, sat on that front porch with your father for 30 years. I have not stopped being that person because I had a health scare, or because I'm 74, or because some of you have decided it's time to start planning for a future that hasn't arrived yet. I looked at Robert. I let him feel that look. I said, I understand that some of you have been thinking about this house and what happens to it. I understand that these are real, practical concerns that live in real people's real lives. But I want to be very clear about something. This house is mine. My decisions about it are mine to make. When I am ready to make them, I will make them with my own attorney, in my own time, with my faculties intact. Thank you. Any conversation about what happens to this house that takes place without me, present, is a conversation I don't recognize and won't accept. I saw Robert's jaw tighten. I saw Diane look down at her hands. I said, I understand that each of you is carrying your own fear. And I want you to know that I see it and I love you for it, for the love underneath the fear, even the parts that hurt. But I am asking you, clearly, and with all the love I have for all four of you, to let me decide what my life looks like, not to arrange my life around me while I'm sleeping, not to treat my future like a project to be managed in my absence. I looked around the room. I said, I want help when I ask for it. I want your company because I love you, not because you're covering a schedule. I want to talk to you, honestly and together, about what the future might look like, but that conversation includes me. It starts with me. It does not happen around me. Thomas, from the footstool by the window, had an expression on his face that I will carry in my memory for the rest of my life. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting for something they weren't sure they would ever see. Robert began, Mum, and stopped. He tried again. I wasn't trying to be. I wasn't trying to cut you out of anything. I was trying to be practical. I said quietly, I know, Robert, but practical from where I was standing felt like being written out of my own story. He was still for a long moment, and then he nodded. Not a surrender, Robert doesn't surrender, but a genuine, honest nod. Diane said, I'm sorry, Mum. I'm genuinely sorry. Her voice was small, stripped of its usual composure. I looked at her. I said, I know, sweetheart. I know you are. And then Susan. Susan had said nothing. She'd been sitting with her hands folded in her lap, looking at them the way she does when she is working through something internal. And then she looked up at me, and all the composure she'd been carrying all week, all year, all these years, was simply gone from her face. She said, Mum, I'm so tired. I crossed the room. I sat beside her on the couch. I took her hands in mine, these hands that have gotten old without my quite noticing, these hands that once held hers when she was 3 years old and frightened of a thunderstorm. I said, I know, Susan, I know you are. And I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. I held her hands. I made sure she was looking at me. What you have done for this family, for me, is not invisible. I see it. I have always seen it. And it is more than any parent has a right to ask. And I am so grateful for it that I don't have proper words. But I need you to hear this. It is not your job to carry me. It is not your job to solve me or fix me or make sure everything goes right. I am asking for your presence. I am not asking for your labor. She wept. The kind of weeping that comes from deep, accumulated pressure finally finding a release. Not pretty, not managed, real. And I held her hands and let it be real. Something shifted in the room after that. Something that had been held tight and airless became softer, not resolved. I am not a person who believes a single conversation resolves anything, and I knew better than to think this one had fixed years of accumulated complexity. But something had been said that had not been said before. Some truth had been placed in the center of the room, and it would stay there. It's been 8 months since that February morning on the kitchen floor. I want to tell you where things are now. Not because the story has a clean ending, lives don't, but because you deserve to know that endings are possible. Not perfect ones, honest ones. I am still in my house. The oak tree Robert's father planted the year Robert was born is budding again, as it does every spring with a kind of patient faithfulness that I find, honestly, comforting. Last week I had coffee on the front porch for the first time since the cold weather, sitting in one of the two rocking chairs. One of them, the way I have for 4 years now, and I looked at the street Frank and I used to watch together, and I felt something that I can only describe as all right. Not perfect. Not healed of everything, but all right. Robert and I had a longer, private conversation about a month after the family meeting. It was the kind of conversation that feels like removing a splinter, painful, necessary, and a relief when it's over. He told me things about his own financial anxieties I hadn't known, some investments that hadn't gone the way he'd expected, a retirement timeline that felt uncertain, a fear of being responsible for things he couldn't control, things he'd been carrying without telling anyone, the way practical men often do. And I told him what it had felt like to overhear that conversation, not to wound him, but because he needed to know. We didn't arrive at perfect understanding. We arrived at something more valuable, honest ground. Diane and I have been talking more. She calls on Sunday evenings now, not to arrange anything, not to report in, just to talk. It surprised us both, how easy those calls became once she wasn't trying to manage me and I wasn't bracing against being managed. She told me, about 3 months in, that she had realized she was trying to control things, because control was the only way she knew how to say she was afraid. I told her that sounded like something I might have done at her age, and she laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it was one of the nicer moments I've had in recent memory. Susan and I are building something. It's the most complex of the relationships, because it has the most history in it, and the deepest investments, and the longest-running misunderstandings. But she came last month, alone, with no agenda, just a weekend. We cooked together. We watched old movies in our pajamas. She told me about her marriage, the ways it had been difficult, things I hadn't known, because she'd been protecting me from knowing them. I told her about the loneliness after Frank died, the things I hadn't said, because I didn't want to be a burden. We sat at the kitchen table and talked until midnight, the way mothers and daughters sometimes do, when they stop managing each other and start telling the truth. Thomas calls every Tuesday evening. No particular reason he's settled on Tuesday. He just calls. I went back to my water aerobics class. I met a woman there named Marjorie, who has silver hair and a very dry sense of humor, and a laugh that sounds like something from another era. One of those laughs that commits completely. We have coffee on Thursday mornings. We talk about everything. She makes me laugh in ways I had forgotten I was capable of. I made an appointment with my estate attorney. I updated my will. I made my decisions about this house clear, deliberate decisions, on my own terms, in my own time, with my faculties entirely intact. When I left that office and drove home, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the hospital. I felt like myself, like a woman who was still at the center of her own life, making her own choices, writing her own story. I want to say something to you directly, if you'll allow me. If you're watching this, and you are somewhere in the middle of what I went through, if you are an older person, and you can feel the world beginning to rearrange itself around you without your permission, if you can feel your family making decisions in the spaces between your conversations, if you have ever felt invisible inside the very relationships that are supposed to see you most clearly, I need you to hear this. You are not finished. You are not a situation requiring management. You are not an inconvenience dressed up as a loved one. The fact that you need care sometimes, or will need more of it eventually, does not erase one single thing about who you are. You are a complete person with authority over your own life. That doesn't end at a diagnosis. That doesn't end with a hospital stay. That doesn't end when your children are more frightened than they know how to manage. And your children's fear, their financial fear, their fear of burden, their fear of watching you in the mirror of their own future, that fear is theirs to carry. You can love them through it. You can have honest conversations about it. But you do not have to make yourself smaller in order to accommodate it. Your dignity is not negotiable. Your presence in your own story is not optional. And if you are one of the children watching this, if something in this story made you uncomfortable in a way that felt personal and recognizable, I am not asking you to feel ashamed. I'm asking you to be honest, because the people you love most in this world deserve to be seen, not managed. They deserve to be heard, not administered to, even when loving them is difficult, even when it costs you something real, even when you are afraid. Fear is human. It's what we do with it that defines us. And for everyone watching, whatever your place in the story, the hardest thing in a family is to tell the truth when the truth is complicated and people you love might be hurt by it. It is almost always worth doing anyway. Not to wound, not to win, but because truth said quietly, said with love, said across a real kitchen table, is the only foundation anything real can be built on. Everything else is just walls that look like relationships until they don't. There's one more thing I want to tell you. 2 months after the family meeting, I was alone in the kitchen on a Sunday morning. Early, before the day had organized itself into demands. The radio was on. The light was coming through the window at the particular spring angle that has always seemed to me the warmest light there is. And I stood at the counter with my coffee, and I thought about all of it. Every piece of it. The hospital, the hallway voices, the folder on the table, the midnight kitchen conversation, the family meeting, the slow and difficult months of everyone finding new ground. I thought, I could still be angry. I have material for anger. And then, but I'm not. I'm not. Not anymore. Not in the way that steals sleep. Because here is what I know what 74 years has made me sure of, in all the ways that matter. Love is not a simple thing. It is not always graceful or generous or clean. It doesn't always look like what it is. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who hurt you most precisely because they love you, because your vulnerability surfaces all of their own. Sometimes caring and fearing and being selfish and being devoted all live in the same person, in the same conversation, in the same midnight kitchen. And sometimes, maybe often, the bravest, most necessary act inside a family is to name what is happening, not to destroy it, not to punish anyone, but because when you tell the truth inside a family, quietly and with love, you give the people you love the chance to be better than their fear. You give them the chance to become who they actually want to be. I told the truth, and my family, imperfect, frightened, complicated, beloved, is becoming something more honest. I stood at the kitchen counter in the morning light, and I thought about Frank, about how he would have moved through all of this differently, more directly, more bluntly, probably more humorously, about that half smile he had, the one I spent 47 years trying to catch on camera. I thought, what would you have said, old man? And in the quiet, the memory of him moved through me like light moves through water all the way to the edges. I said to the kitchen, to the table, the window, the tree outside it, I said, I'm all right. We're all right. And I believed it. I started this story by telling you about a woman who lay in a hospital bed and smiled because she could hear her children arguing about her, who believed, completely innocently believed, that the fighting was love. I want to end it by telling you something I didn't know then, that I know now. She wasn't entirely wrong. It was love, tangled and frightened and impure and partly self-interested and partly real, but love, underneath all of it. The kind that families carry when they don't have better tools. The kind that gets expressed sideways and comes out wrong, and causes damage it didn't mean to cause. The kind that needs to be called by its name before it can become what it wants to be. My grandmother used to say that a family is not its best moments. It's not the holiday photographs or the milestone celebrations or the clean, generous times when everyone behaved beautifully and nobody was afraid. A family is the hard conversations, the terrible Tuesday nights, the things said in kitchens at midnight that never should have been said, and what you decide to do with all of that afterward. She was right. She was deeply, uncomplicatedly right. If you've been carrying something like what I carried, some quiet, complicated family hurt that doesn't have a simple name, that lives in the particular space between loving people and being failed by them, I hope this story gave you something. not answers. I don't have answers, but company, maybe. The feeling of sitting across a table from someone else who has been through something like this and come through it with her heart more or less intact. You are not alone in this. Quiet family pain is one of the most common human experiences there is, and one of the least talked about. Because who do you tell about the people who are supposed to be your people? You can tell here. That's what this place is for. If this story reached something in you, if it stirred a memory, a recognition, a feeling you've been carrying without knowing where to put it, I hope you'll stay. I have more of these, more quiet stories that people carry for years without ever saying out loud. Subscribe if you'd like. Come back when you need to. This is a quiet space, and you're welcome here. After Frank died, I went through his things slowly, over many months, the way grief requires. One afternoon I found a piece of paper folded in the drawer of his nightstand. Old, soft with age, his handwriting slightly faded. I don't know when he wrote it or what prompted it, but it said, "The bravest thing you'll ever do is keep loving people in all their particular imperfections, including yourself." I put it in my own drawer, on my side of the bed. I read it still. My name is Eleanor. I am 74 years old. I collapsed in my kitchen, and I woke up in a hospital room, and I heard things no mother should have to hear, and I lost, for a while, the simple, innocent faith that love is uncomplicated. But I am still here, still in my house, still at my table, still having coffee on the front porch in the spring, in one of the 2 rocking chairs. The oak tree is still growing, and I have decided that is more than enough. I have decided it is more than enough.